Hello guys, it's Saran Few, and I'm going to be going over our last chapter in Radical Behaviorism for ABA practitioners, Chapter 10, talking about radical behaviorism, sorry. So going right in, the philosophy of the science of behavior analysis. Radical behaviorism is not the scientific study of behavior. The most important feature of radical behaviorism as a scientific philosophy is that behavior analysts view verbal behavior no different from any other kind of behavior. And I'm going to go in more detail as we go on to explaining what I mean by that. So, verbal behavior in radical behaviorism is working around kind of the laws of operant learning. So, Johnston mentioned something that Moore says within the first chapter is observations of science of behavior and analysis that serves as the basis for the philosophy of radical behaviorism, which in turn the foundation for the science. So Johnston was talking about how the different realms of philosophy, psychology, theology, all these realms have their own. Yes, they're in their own realms for kind of in a respectful manner, and the radical behaviorism is not at this point in its own realm or viewed as anything different. It's just kind of a fictional idea at this point. So Johnston also goes on after that to mention a quote by Skinner, or a statement by Skinner, about studying behavior is interesting, being that behavior was more so studied in different realms. Behavior is a subject matter in its own right and should have nothing to do, sorry, I'm looking at my notes, should do with mentalism. So radical behaviorism is a set of relations. It goes about studying an organism in its environment and looking at the organism on a psychological level is just not enough to explain the behavior, being that you can come up with theories all day as to why this person is doing this, but that's technically still mentalism because you're giving reasons and you're trying to get inside the person's head and explain why they're doing it. So that kind of was getting confusing because the next part, because I'm still, while reading, I was kind of getting this idea of what radical behaviorism is in the sense of not using those mentalistic terms. So radical behaviorism tells us that a behavior has happening much more so than in a private event than what can be seen by just observing or looking in. The whole idea is not ignoring what may be happening in the private event, but we need to be careful not to turn the private event into mentalism, which throughout this chapter there's examples of how, as researchers, we have to be very careful not to come up with our own ideas as to why our participants are acting the way they're acting or exhibiting behaviors the way they're exhibiting behaviors. We're not in their head. We don't know exactly what's going on. So we have to be very careful of that. We have to look at their environment and use the observations of physical data within their environment to to then grasp a logical and reason based on evidence as to why they're acting or their behavior is being influenced. So researchers, and I'm going to go over this as well, researchers were very careful because they didn't really count any data that wasn't public, but they changed but due to their mentalistic thinking, it explained behavior. So the idea of mentalism came originally from the explanations of why someone is acting the way they're acting. And one of the examples the book gave is anxiety. There's different things that happen when someone's very nervous about something or anxious about something, and the past researchers were saying that their mentalistic ways of thinking was an explanation for why that person is acting that way. So even scientists have to be careful that they explain their own behaviors when making decisions about their participants' behaviors, actions. So the example that the book gave is a questionnaire where these researchers have come up with different reasons as to why their patients may be acting like this, but that's still technically mentalism. They're coming up with their own reasons. They're not having the participant using verbal behaviors to explain to them or make it known publicly why they are acting or exhibiting behavior that they're exhibiting. So radical behaviorism is also an approach to dealing with private events by focusing on the environmental sources of control over the scientific verbal behavior. It avoids mentalistic ways of explaining anxiety, which is that example, to what stimuli is getting that response, this allows the physical observation of that data that can be studied. So what I'm saying there, or what they're saying there, and my understanding or interpretation of it is that radical behaviorism is not jumping necessarily into the person's head and reading their private thoughts. No, it's talking about observing someone in their environment, seeing how different stimuli within that environment is influencing the behavior. They're studying that as they're studying the stimuli that's reinforcing that behavior to continue to happen. Going from there, the historical content, where it's talking about the main focus of this was Watson's early work was the beginning of the behavioral movement. He started the classical stimulus response behavior. Anything having to do with mental phenomena was just seen as fictional. And Skinner didn't agree and says that verbal behavior involved an approach to private events that made public, which avoids mentalism by understanding the control of the speaker, which in that environment is saying influences the behavior. So saying before, where these mental phenomena of people are the researchers jumping to the person's private events or their private thoughts is not necessarily true. You're basically taking their actions within an environment and using those actions as your data for why that person's acting or exhibiting the way they're acting. So part of the next part, or the next section or subsection, was radical behaviorism versus methodological behaviorism, which I kind of got. At first I didn't understand, but I finally got it. So comparing radical to methodological behavior. Methodological behaviorism is a way of thinking about scientific methods that come from conventional experimental practices and their underlying rationale. So this is talking about coming up with a bright theory and or a theory as to why they're happening, but that's completely mentalism. That has nothing to do necessarily with why the person or why your participant is acting or exhibiting these behaviors. It's all just the knowledge of, or the thinking of, because I am a researcher, I have all the superior knowledge and I know exactly what that person's doing. So these thoughts may seem reasonable to that researcher, but they're all based on mentalism as to how the scientist is thinking or viewing the methods of reasoning. So as reviewed in Chapter 6, way before, since back in the past, we see that reasoning should not be viewed in a special way. It's just the behavior under environmental control. So Johnston is saying that the methodological behaviorism is all mentalistic in explaining behavior, while radical behaviorism is different because the approach in behavior involving both the researcher and the participant, and also the environment and the influences within that environment, within that contingency as to why the person or why your participant may be exhibiting those behaviors. It's understanding the sources of the behaviors, not really reasoning on a logical manner. So Johnston also uses a more quote that I kind of stuck out to me. The researcher's verbal behavior will lead to sound descriptions and effective predictions when it is controlled by variables in the experimental environment, not basing it on logical theoretical features. So that's kind of the biggest point that made sense towards the end of that subsection, because at first I wasn't sure what the difference was, but it makes sense now. So kind of a quick recap. Methodological behaviorism is just the theories that are completely based on mentalism as to why the researcher may think the participants having that behavior or is exhibiting that behavior. And radical behaviorism is using the environment, the natural environment, and observing the influences within that environment that strongly suggest as to why those behaviors may be exhibited. So last part, a matter of opinion. These are the theoretical features. The main point of this was the purpose of radical behaviorism is for behavior analysts to ask experimental questions based on, and these are good experimental questions, based on the influence of behavior. So those were kind of the main points of this chapter or the last chapter. And I will have my question posted for you guys on the Blackboard page. All right, thanks.